He spent 20 years becoming a weapon. He spent 12 years trying to become nothing. And one drowning girl just made both impossible. This video is an independent, transformative work created for review, criticism, commentary, educational, informational, and entertainment purposes. Any third-party content is used only to support original analysis and is not intended to replace or reproduce the original work. Michael Mason wakes before dawn on a Scottish island where no one has looked for him in 12 years, and that absence is the closest thing he has to peace. His name wasn't always Michael Mason. For most of his life, he was Michael Masso, a designation, not a name, a precision instrument in the hands of British intelligence's most classified program. The Black Kite division didn't recruit soldiers or assassins in the traditional sense. They took men with a certain kind of emptiness, a certain capacity to compartmentalize brutality into routine, and they refined that emptiness into something that resembled purpose. Masso became their best work. He was deployed across 3 continents over 20 years. Every target had a file. Every file had intelligence justifying elimination. And every operation was executed with a cleanliness that left no trace of regret, no hesitation, no moment where conscience interfered with protocol. He learned to see the world in terms of variables, distance, trajectory, wind, exit strategy. He learned to recognize the instant when a target's nervous system would begin to fail. He learned to make the decision to end a life with the same emotional weight most people gave to choosing what to eat for breakfast. By the time he was 38 years old, Michael Masso had become so efficient at erasing other people that he understood he was the next person who needed erasing. Not because he'd failed at his job, because he'd succeeded too completely. A man that good at being lethal becomes a liability. A man that good at disappearing becomes a problem, because he knows how the system works, and he knows what systems like that do to loose ends. So he disappeared first. He chose an island off the coast of Scotland. He chose a lighthouse where supplies arrived monthly by boat, and where the nearest neighbor was miles of black rock and gray water. He chose a life so deliberately minimal that it barely constituted existence. And for 12 years, that choice held. He wakes at 5 in the morning, regardless of whether the sun will rise. He climbs the 73 steps to the lighthouse gallery. He looks at the water. He descends. He makes coffee in a kettle that's older than his assumed identity. He reads books, not for entertainment, but because routine requires activity, and reading is an activity that doesn't require leaving the island. Once a week, on Thursdays, a boat arrives with supplies. The driver is a young girl named Jessie, an orphan who lives with her uncle and supplements her limited income by running deliveries to the lighthouse. Mason doesn't know her story. He doesn't ask. She doesn't ask his. Their interactions consist of the exchange of a small cargo box for an envelope of cash. Same time next week, she always asks. Same time next week, he always answers. This is the entirety of his human contact. This is the life he chose. This is the sanctuary he built. And this is the life that's about to detonate. The storm arrives on a Tuesday, which is the first indication that something is wrong. Storms don't follow patterns on the Scottish coast. They arrive when they arrive, indifferent to schedules and routines and the carefully constructed expectations of a man who has built his entire existence on predictability. This storm comes hard and fast, with wind that sounds like something alive, like the island itself is being torn from the sea. Mason watches from the lighthouse gallery, a position of safety that allows observation without engagement. He's watched storms here before. The island has weathered worse. But something in this storm feels different, felt before it even arrives, in the way animals sense earthquakes seconds before the earth moves. He's felt this feeling once before, 20 years ago, when he was being hunted by a rival intelligence agency, and he somehow knew, without seeing evidence or hearing information, that they were coming. His nervous system knows how to recognize danger. It still works perfectly. The storm hits the island like someone trying to batter down a door. The water rises. The wind reaches speeds that make the lighthouse creak in ways it isn't supposed to creak. And then Mason hears something that cuts through every other sound. A voice. Human. Screaming. He tells himself it's the wind. The wind does that sometimes. Carries sounds that mimic voices. Creates the illusion of human presence in places where no human could possibly be. But he's heard the wind on this island for 12 years. He knows its voice. This is something else. This is someone. He moves without deciding to move. 12 years of isolation fall away. 12 years of being nobody. Of maintaining zero human contact protocols. Of treating the outside world as a contamination vector. All of it vanishes in the moment it takes to understand that someone is drowning. He descends the lighthouse stairs 3 at a time. He reaches the shore. The rocks are slick and dangerous. The water a chaos of black and white foam. And then he sees her. Jessie, the girl who delivers his supplies once a week. Her small body is caught in the rocks, the current trying to pull her into deeper water. Her mouth is open. Her eyes are wide. She's drowning, and she's conscious enough to know it. Conscious cautious enough to know that no one is coming, except someone is. Mason moves into the water without hesitation, without calculation, without any of the careful tactical analysis that's defined his entire adult existence. He doesn't think about outcomes or risk assessment. He doesn't consider whether rescuing her creates complications. He simply moves, because some responses are older than the man he became, older than the training and the compartmentalization and the 2 decades spent making his emotions irrelevant. He pulls her from the rocks. He carries her back to the lighthouse. And in that single act of spontaneous compassion, he erases the protective isolation he spent 12 years constructing. He has no idea yet how completely he's destabilized his own sanctuary. What happens after the rescue is a series of events that reveals the true architecture of the story that Shelter is actually telling. Not a story about action or violence, but a story about what happens when a man's attempt to be human collides directly with his nature as something far more lethal. Jessie survives. Mason knows how to revive someone from near drowning. He learned that skill in military training decades ago, back when he was being taught how to kill and how to keep himself alive long enough to kill again. She coughs. She breathes. She's alive. And while she's recovering consciousness, her uncle Michael Schaefer arrives at the lighthouse. Schaefer is one of the few people on Earth who knows what Mason truly is. They served together in the Royal Marines, back before Mason was recruited into Black Kite, back before he became something else entirely. Schaefer has his own history, military service, intelligence work, the kind of past that leaves permanent marks on a person's psychology. But unlike Mason, Schaefer never disappeared. He built a life. He has connections to the civilian world. He works as an informant and facilitator, someone who moves between the intelligence community and ordinary people, doing the work that requires deniability. Schaefer's arrival on the island isn't coincidence. He'd heard that Jessie nearly drowned. As her uncle, he came to check on her. He found her in the lighthouse, being cared for by a man he recognizes immediately, despite 12 years of separation and isolation. Mason sees the recognition in Schaefer's face and understands instantly that something has changed. The sanctuary is compromised. Schaefer delivers news that transforms the situation from rescue into crisis. The drowning was witnessed, not by many people, but by enough. Shaw's human trafficking network operates along the Scottish coast, using the waterways for their darker business. They saw a man emerge from the rocks during the storm. They saw him save a girl. More importantly, they saw someone moving with purpose and efficiency in conditions where most people would be paralyzed by fear. They saw competence. They saw someone who belonged to a category of person they recognize, someone trained, someone dangerous, someone who shouldn't exist on a remote island. Mason's rescue of Jessie wasn't just an act of compassion. It was an exposure. And in the world that Mason spent 12 years trying to escape, exposure is always a death sentence. Schaefer explains that people are being eliminated. Former Black Kite operatives are dying one by one in carefully executed operations. Someone is cleaning house. Someone has decided that the old program and everyone connected to it represents a liability that needs permanent removal. James Workman is leading that removal. Workman trained alongside Mason. They rose through Black Kite ranks together. They understand each other's methods because they studied the same curriculum of death. And Workman has been tasked with ensuring that Mason, like all the others, is neutralized. The lighthouse was supposed to be shelter, but now it's become a trap with only one way out: forward, into the violence that Mason spent 12 years trying to outrun. The first act of Shelter establishes something that most action films never bother to explore: the psychology of a man confronting his own superfluity in a system he served faithfully. Mason isn't being hunted because he's a threat to national security or because he knows dangerous secrets. He's being hunted because he's a reminder that the system he served still exists, and that's politically inconvenient. The Black Kite program operated in legal and moral gray zones so dark that they barely qualified as gray anymore. It was assassination by government decree, with all the deniability and none of the accountability. Personnel like Mason were tools, perfect, efficient, entirely expendable. And now, apparently, it was time to dispose of the tools. What Ric Roman Waugh's direction captures throughout this section is the terrible isolation of a man who understands this mathematics perfectly. Mason isn't shocked. He isn't surprised. He isn't even particularly angry. He's recognizing a game he's already lost, played by rules he helped establish. The question that emerges, though, the question that propels everything forward, is whether Mason's compassionate instinct to save Jessie represents a fundamental change in who he is, or merely a moment of weakness in an essential nature that violence has carved into his very being. Director Waugh introduces this question not through dialogue, but through performance. Jason Statham plays this moment of realization with minimal effect, which is exactly right. There's no dramatic collapse. There's no moment of despair. There's simply the quiet quiet understanding that the man he tried to become is incompatible with the man he actually is. Jessie recovers. She's confused. She has no memory of the drowning, only the aftermath. She asks where she is. She asks what happened. Mason explains, with characteristic sparseness, that she nearly drowned and that he pulled her from the water. She thanks him. It's a simple exchange, but it carries the emotional weight of the entire film. Because in that exchange, we see Jessie looking at Mason and seeing a savior, seeing someone good. And we see Mason looking at Jessie and seeing a liability, seeing someone he's already put in danger by saving. The contradiction is total. His compassion created the exact danger he was trying to protect her from. And now, because he saved her life is in more danger than it's ever been. This is the central emotional trap of Shelter. A man who has learned to never want anything now wants something. The safety of a child who depends on him, and that wanting will cost him everything. Schaefer doesn't minimize the danger. He explains it in the precise, clinical language of someone who has spent decades understanding how intelligence agencies operate when they decide to erase their own mistakes. The Black Kite program was never supposed to exist beyond plausible deniability. It was a tool used in shadows, authorized by people with enough security clearance to make decisions that civilians would call murder, but that government functionaries classified differently. Every operative in that program understood one thing at inception: our usefulness has an expiration date. We are deployable. We are disposable. We are temporary. Workman has apparently decided that the expiration date for everyone involved has arrived simultaneously. He's been systematically moving through the roster: operatives, handlers, analysts, even some of the political figures who authorize certain operations. He's not just killing them, he's erasing them from records, making their deaths look like accidents or unconnected incidents, covering the traces so thoroughly that it becomes impossible to prove that Black Kite ever existed at all. This is sophisticated work, the kind of work that requires intimate knowledge of how the program operated. Workman knows the protocols because he helped establish them. He knows which operatives are where because he's kept tabs on people for years, waiting for this moment. Mason understands immediately that Workman has probably been hunting him for weeks, maybe months. The surveillance would have been patient. The approach would have been methodical. Workman would have wanted to understand Mason's patterns, his vulnerabilities, his psychological state after 12 years of isolation. And then the storm came. The storm gave Workman the opportunity he'd been waiting for, a moment when Mason would be distracted, when his attention would be fractured between isolation and newly acquired responsibility. Schaefer warns that people are already on their way to the island. Not yet, maybe not for another day or two, but coming. The warning itself is the time they have. Schaefer offers resources, money, access to safe houses, vehicles, papers, all the infrastructure that someone like him has access to when he moves between intelligence and criminal networks. Mason accepts this offer without much consideration. He's calculating angles now, his mind shifting into the operational patterns he hasn't used in 12 years, but which are still there, perfectly preserved in muscle memory and strategic thinking. He's planning how to evacuate Jessie. He's considering whether she'll survive the journey or whether her presence will make everything worse. He's understanding that salvation and damnation have become geometrically impossible to separate. Schaefer, watching this calculation happen on Mason's face, says something that cuts to the heart of everything. The man who saves her becomes the thing that destroys her. It's not a question. It's an observation. It's a statement about the essential mathematics of Mason's situation. By choosing to rescue Jessie, he's guaranteed her exposure to danger. By choosing to protect her, he'll have to become the very thing he was trying to escape by coming to this island in the first place. He'll have to become the weapon again. He'll have to reactivate every lethal capability that 12 years of isolation were supposed to have dormant. And that reactivation will inevitably transfer danger to everyone around him, including the girl who did nothing except nearly drown at the wrong moment in the wrong storm. They leave the island under cover of darkness, moving quickly but without panic. Mason has packed only essentials: money, weapons he's kept hidden in the lighthouse basement for exactly this scenario, documents with multiple identities prepared years ago. He moves like a man who has been expecting this day, who has maintained readiness even while pretending to be dormant. This is the first indication of something the film explores throughout its runtime. Mason never actually stopped being an assassin. He just stopped killing. The training, the readiness, the tactical awareness, these don't dissolve during 12 years of watching birds and reading books. They calcify. They wait. Jessie is confused and frightened. She's still recovering from the drowning. Her body is weak from near death. And now this man who saved her is moving her through dark water in a small boat toward an uncertain destination. She asks him where they're going. He doesn't answer. The question is unanswerable. There is no destination that's safe. There's only direction, away, and speed. Schaefer pilots the boat. He has connections all along the Scottish coast. People people who owe him favors or who work for him or who simply recognize his authority in these circumstances. They move to a safe house an hour inland, a nondescript cottage on property owned through shell corporations and money laundering schemes that make it impossible to trace. It's the kind of location that intelligence operatives maintain specifically for moments like this, moments when the system eats itself and you need somewhere to hide while deciding what comes next. Inside the cottage, Mason tends to Jessie. He finds her dry clothes. He provides water and food. He watches her with something that resembles tenderness, but that is also entirely practical. An assessment of her physical condition, her psychological stability, her utility as an asset versus her status as a liability. This is the cruel duality that plays across Statham's face in these scenes. He genuinely cares about this girl's well-being, and he's simultaneously calculating whether her survival is compatible with his own. The film doesn't judge Mason for this duality. It simply presents it. He is a man who has been trained to see people as problems to be solved, and he's trying, however imperfectly, to become someone who can see a person as a person rather than an obstacle. It's not a transformation that completes in a single scene. It's a struggle that will define his entire journey forward. Jessie begins to understand, slowly, that the man in the lighthouse is not who she thought he was. She asks him directly, "Are you in trouble?" He answers, "Yes." She asks, "Did I cause it?" He answers, "No, I did, when I saved you." The honesty of this exchange, the lack of false reassurance or protective lying, establishes the actual emotional foundation of the film. Mason isn't going to comfort Jessie with false promises that everything will be fine. He's going to be honest about the danger, the cost, and the reality that her proximity to him has fundamentally altered the trajectory of her life. She'll have to decide whether that trade, her safety for the truth, is something she can accept. She's 14 years old. She makes the acceptance anyway. What happens next is a masterclass in screenwriting that understands the difference between plot mechanics and character revelation. Workman doesn't attack the island immediately. He arrives to find it empty. He finds the lighthouse still warm. He finds evidence that Mason departed hastily but methodically, and this absence tells Workman everything he needs to know. Mason is still the operative that Workman trained alongside. Mason hasn't forgotten how to move. Mason hasn't forgotten how to disappear. This is the moment when the hunt becomes personal. It's not just an assignment anymore. It's a challenge to Workman's own mastery, his own competence. If Mason can vanish this completely, that means Workman has missed something, has calculated incorrectly, has allowed prey to escape that should have been cornered. Workman brings other operatives with him, Black Kite veterans, men and women who understand the system and who are motivated by the same mixture of loyalty and self-preservation that drives all institutional violence. They spread across Scotland, accessing resources that most private citizens don't know exist: surveillance networks, informant databases, travel records, banking traces. They're hunting not just a man, but a man who used to hunt alongside them. They know how he thinks because they were trained in the same methodologies. They anticipate his moves because they've studied his previous operations. Every advantage that Mason gained from 12 years of isolation evaporates the moment Workman decides to pursue him as a personal objective rather than just another name on a purge list. Mason understands this. He knows that Workman is better than the average operative pursuing him because Workman was the best of his generation, which means Workman was trained by the same people who trained Mason in the same methods with the same psychological conditioning. They're mirrors of each other in some fundamental way. Two men shaped by institutional violence, diverging only in what they chose to do when the institution no longer needed them. Workman chose to keep working. Mason chose to stop. And now their divergence will determine not just who survives, but whether survival even means escape or merely extended postponement of inevitable elimination. The cottage safe house becomes a waypoint, not a sanctuary. Mason knows they can't stay here long. Within 24 hours, Workman will have traced the money that paid for the cottage. Within 48 hours, he'll have identified Schaefer's involvement. Within 72 hours, this location will be hot, meaning it will be compromised, meaning staying here means being surrounded. Mason uses these hours to acquire what he needs: cash in multiple currencies, weapons through channels Schaefer maintains, and false documentation that will allow them to move through airports and border crossings without triggering the kind of automated alerts that would make traditional escape impossible. He's building an operation. He's treating Jessie's extraction from danger the same way he'd treat any classified extraction, with tradecraft, with resources, with the cold operational logic of someone who understands that sentiment and survival occupy opposite ends of a spectrum. The psychological shift that occurs across Act 2 is subtle but complete. Mason transitions from a man trying to be nothing into a man trying to be something specific, not a savior, because he's too honest with himself to claim that delusion, but rather a tool tool repurposed toward protecting instead of eliminating. This is not redemption. This is reclassification. Waugh's direction during these sequences emphasizes isolation within crowded spaces. When Mason and Jessie move through a small town, acquiring supplies, they're surrounded by ordinary people living ordinary lives, but they exist in a bubble of danger that separates them from those civilians. The cinematography by Martin Algren uses color desaturation and angular framing to suggest that Mason and Jessie are existing slightly outside the normal world, present physically but absent existentially. Every person they pass is a potential threat. Every direction they haven't yet traveled is a possible ambush. Every moment of safety is measured in hours before it becomes untenable. What emerges across Act 2 is also the beginning of the film's thematic exploration. Can a person shaped entirely by violence learn to value something beyond survival? Can someone trained to see the world as a series of tactical problems develop enough emotional capacity to protect another person without using them as a tactical advantage? Mason's answer to these questions is tested constantly. He has opportunities to abandon Jessie, to use her as a distraction while he escapes alone, to trade her to workmen in exchange for his own survival, to simply leave her somewhere and trust that Schaefer's resources might keep her safe without Mason's direct involvement. He doesn't take any of these opportunities, but the film is clear that these possibilities exist, that Mason considers them, and that his refusal of them comes at genuine cost. The decision to protect Jessie isn't presented as morally obvious. It's presented as a choice that Mason makes against his training, against his survival instinct, against the accumulated wisdom of someone who has learned that attachment is always a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. Bill Nighy, in his brief scenes as Schaefer, embodies what Mason could have become, a man who survived by remaining fundamentally detached from human connection, who exists in the interstices of criminal and governmental networks without belonging to either. Schaefer isn't malevolent. He simply accepted that his utility depends on his ability to maintain distance. Mason, by contrast, is attempting something he was never trained for: connection, intimacy, the vulnerability that comes from genuinely caring whether another person lives or dies. By the end of Act 2, the trajectory of the film is clear. Mason and Jessie have left the island behind. They're moving deeper into danger, and Mason, for the first time in 12 years, has something to lose besides his own life. This is the trap that Schaefer warned about, now fully sprung. By the third day in the safe house, Workman has narrowed the search perimeter to a 50-kilometer radius around the island. He's done this through a combination of methods that demonstrates why he was chosen for this elimination task: access to traffic camera footage, correlation of vehicle movement patterns, analysis of financial transactions made by Schaefer's network. Workman doesn't need to know exactly where Mason is going. He needs only to reduce the available space where Mason could possibly go, and then apply pressure methodically until the cornered man has nowhere left to move except toward him. Mason is aware of this mathematical tightening. He watches Workman's operatives close in through intelligence channels, police reports of suspicious activity, sudden surveillance of safe houses Schaefer maintains, the movement of Black Kite assets into strategic positions. It's a hunt conducted with professional precision, and Mason recognizes every step because he's employed these exact methods himself. The difference is that Mason was always hunting people who were unaware they were being hunted. Now he's hunting, or rather, being hunted by, someone who knows his playbook because they studied from the same manual. This creates a stalemate of knowledge. Workman can anticipate Mason's moves because Mason's moves are predictable to anyone trained in the same discipline. But Mason can anticipate Workman's anticipation, creating a recursive loop of strategic planning that spirals toward a collision point. Mason decides they can't stay in Scotland. The country is too small, the resources too consolidated, the reach of Workman's network too extensive. They need to move south, toward London, toward population density and chaos that might provide cover. Moving with a child through public transportation while being hunted by operatives with surveillance access seems impossible. It almost is. Mason acquires a vehicle through Schaefer's contacts, a nondescript van registered to a shell corporation and paid for in ways that will take weeks to trace. He drives them south, moving during night hours when traffic cameras are less likely to be actively monitored, taking routes that avoid major highways where vehicle checks might occur. Jessie sleeps in the back of the van, still weak from the near drowning, still processing the reality that her entire life has been restructured in 48 hours. Mason drives and watches the mirrors and calculates constantly. He's running scenarios. If Workman figures out the vector toward London, how much head start does Mason have? If they stop for fuel, what's the probability of recognition? If they reach London, what resources exist there that Workman won't have access to? Every decision is cost-benefit analysis weighted against survival survival probability. The part of Mason that was trying to become human during 12 years of isolation fades further into the background. The part that's a weapon activates fully. This isn't transformation, it's devolution. The man he tried to become is incompatible with keeping Jessie alive, so he stops trying to be that man. He becomes instead what circumstances demand, a predator operating in defensive mode, violent and ruthless and entirely focused on ensuring that the girl in the back of the van takes another breath tomorrow. They arrive in London just after dawn, pulling into a garage in Bethnal Green that Schaefer has maintained through intermediaries for years. It's the kind of location that exists in the interstices of legitimate and criminal activity. A repair shop that fixes vehicles but never reports them, owned by a man named Kamal Shah who operates in multiple capacities depending on which side of the transaction he's conducting. Shah is a human trafficker, a criminal facilitator, and simultaneously an informant for British intelligence, a position that requires extraordinary negotiating ability and fundamental amorality. He recognizes Schaefer's name and accepts payment without asking questions, providing Mason with a second vehicle, a studio apartment in Whitechapel, and access to a network of people who specialize in making individuals disappear within the urban landscape. London is different from Scotland. It's chaos organized into systems. It's millions of people moving through surveillance networks that are so comprehensive that they become useless. Too much data, too many variables, too much noise to distinguish meaningful patterns. Mason begins to understand that their survival probability increases in direct proportion to their ability to become invisible within the density of human movement. Jessie wakes up in the apartment, a small, sparse space with minimal furniture and no windows looking directly onto the street. She asks if this is where they'll stay. Mason tells her the truth. Nowhere is safe. They'll stay until this location becomes compromised, and then they'll move again. Everywhere is temporary. Everywhere is contingent. She accepts this with a stoicism that shouldn't be possible for a 14-year-old girl, but that has been forged by trauma accelerated into maturity. She asks him what she should do. He tells her to stay inside. She asks why. He tells her because the moment she steps outside, she becomes visible to people who want to use her against him. She accepts this confinement with remarkable lack of resistance, though whether that acceptance comes from understanding or resignation remains unclear. Mason begins teaching her things that a 14-year-old should never need to know: how to recognize surveillance, how to identify exits in any space she enters, how to understand the difference between routine danger and imminent danger, how to move through crowds without being noticed. He's training her to be a ghost. He's training her to operate in the criminal underworld that Schaefer exists in, the world that Mason spent his entire adult life inhabiting. He's passing on the competencies of his own corruption as though these are survival skills necessary for any human being. Bodhi Rae Breathnach's performance during these sequences is extraordinary precisely because she plays Jessie as both traumatized and resilient, both frightened and learning, both child and something darker that's been forged by proximity to danger. She never complains. She never asks why this is happening. She simply absorbs the knowledge and becomes incrementally more dangerous as she learns to protect herself. There's something tragic in this transformation, the loss of childhood innocence accelerated by circumstance into operational competence. Mason is creating a liability asset out of necessity, and the film doesn't excuse this. It simply shows it happening. Workman arrives in London 5 days after Mason does. He doesn't search haphazardly. He doesn't rely on surveillance networks that Mason might anticipate him accessing. Instead, he goes directly to Kamal Shah and makes his position clear. Find Mason, and there's a substantial payment. Don't find Mason, and Workman will make certain that Shah's network is exposed to every law enforcement agency in Western Europe, destroying everything Shah has built across 3 continents. It's a form of negotiation that doesn't allow for counterargument. Shah cooperates. He provides Workman with information about Mason's arrival, the location of the garage, the details of the apartment rental. Shah is an intelligent man. He understands that Workman represents a more immediate threat than Mason does, and he acts accordingly. Within 72 hours, Workman has narrowed Mason's location to a 3-block radius. He doesn't move immediately. He establishes surveillance posts. He positions operatives. He waits for Mason to make the mistake that all hunted prey eventually make, the mistake of thinking they've found safety. Mason becomes aware that they've been found, not through definitive evidence, but through the subtle indicators that someone trained to recognize danger never ignores. There's a man in a parked car across from the apartment building. There's a second man who walks the block at intervals that are too regular to be coincidental. There's the feeling of being watched, which Mason has learned to trust as much as any physical evidence. He tells Jessie to pack one bag. He tells her they're leaving in the next hour. She doesn't ask why. She packs. The escape from London is more complicated than the escape from Scotland because London is maze-like, because every exit is controlled, because Workman has learned from Mason's previous movements and has adjusted his strategy accordingly. Mason uses Schaefer's network one final time, acquiring false documentation and access to transport that will move them out of the city through routes that avoid the standard surveillance infrastructure. But getting out requires passing through the inner city, and passing through the inner city requires visibility, requires risk, requires the kind of operational choice that separates survival from elimination. Workman is waiting at the only viable exit point. He has operatives positioned to intercept. He has weapons. He has the advantage of preparation and positioning. Mason understands that there will be no negotiation, no conversation, no moment of reflection or mercy. When they meet, one of them will die, probably both of them, and Jessie will either escape in the chaos or she'll become collateral damage, which Workman will regret professionally but not personally. This is the moment where everything that has preceded it, the island, the rescue, the flight south, the teaching of operational tradecraft, crystallizes into a single decision point. Mason can attempt to fight his way through, which means violence and exposure and probable failure, or he can choose a different path. That choice, and what it reveals about Mason's fundamental nature, defines the final movement of the film. What occurs at the climactic confrontation in Act 3 is not a typical action sequence, though the film contains elements of action. Instead, what Waugh delivers is something rarer, a confrontation between two men who understand each other so completely that words become almost unnecessary. Mason sees Workman. Workman sees Mason. And in that moment of mutual recognition, both men understand exactly what's happening and why. Workman hasn't come to capture Mason. He's come to kill him. Mason hasn't come to negotiate. He's come to protect Jessie, which means eliminating the threat that Workman represents. But the elegance of their training is that they don't immediately resort to violence. They acknowledge what's occurring, and they discuss it briefly, and that discussion reveals the film's central thematic concern. What happens to men shaped entirely by institutional violence when they try to become something else? Workman tells Mason that this is futile, that the system will keep sending people, that there's no winning against an institutional mandate to eliminate. He's not wrong. He's stating an operational reality that both men understand. Mason replies that he's not trying to win. He's trying to buy time. He's trying to ensure that Jessie escapes. He's trying to matter to something beyond himself for the first time in his life. Workman considers this and finds it incomprehensible. To Workman, sentiment is a weakness. Attachment is a vulnerability. The idea that Mason would willingly limit his options to protect another person seems like madness to someone trained to prioritize survival above all else. The confrontation that follows is brutal and efficient. Both men are extraordinarily capable. Both men understand exactly how to cause maximum damage with minimum movement. The violence is choreographed in a way that prioritizes realism over spectacle, the impact of training and physical skill applied with maximum efficiency. This is not Hollywood combat. This is professional violence enacted by people who have trained for decades to cause harm. Someone dies in this confrontation. The film doesn't hide the cost or minimize the impact. The death itself becomes the narrative pivot point that forces Mason into his final transformation. He's no longer operating in defensive mode. He's no longer trying to survive. He's no longer calculating probability and risk. He's shifted into something that transcends operational logic. He's become willing to trade his own life for Jessie's safety. This shift is what changes everything that comes after, because it means that Mason has finally become something other than what the system made him. He's become someone capable of love. If we define love as the willingness to accept death rather than allow harm to someone you're responsible for protecting, whether that love is redemption or simply a different form of damnation remains the question that the film will wrestle with until its final frame. James Workman dies in a parking garage in Hackney with a bullet wound that should have been survivable, except Mason doesn't leave him time to survive. The choice to finish Workman, rather than simply incapacitate him and run, represents a threshold that Mason crosses without acknowledgement or ceremony. It's not an emotional moment. It's tactical. Workman is wounded but still capable of signaling to his team. Workman is breathing but still able to coordinate pursuit. The only way to guarantee that Jessie can escape is to guarantee that Workman won't be coordinating anything anymore. So Mason makes the choice that any trained operative would make. He completes the elimination. What happens afterward is a series of consequences that the film explores with unflinching clarity. Workman's death creates a vacuum. Black Kite operatives who were coordinating under his direction suddenly lose command structure. They lose clarity of purpose. They have a dead commander and no authorization to continue the purge. The system doesn't automatically replace Workman with another operative. Instead, it enters a moment of bureaucratic paralysis, a gap in the chain of command during which no one wants to assume responsibility for continuing an operation that has already claimed multiple lives and that is generating heat from law enforcement. Mason uses this window. He and Jessie move from London through a series of safe houses that Schaefer maintains across England. He doesn't try to leave the country. That would be impossible. Every border crossing is monitored, every airport is alert, and attempting to flee internationally would immediately flag their location. Instead, he moves deeper into England, toward the countryside, toward smaller population centers where surveillance is thinner and where people are less likely to notice a man and a girl moving through their lives. He's creating distance and time. The distance is measured in miles. The time is measured in the assumption that institutional response is slower than individual movement. For several days, it seems to work. They reach a farmhouse in the Cotswolds, owned through a shell corporation that traces back through layers of intermediaries until it becomes impossible to determine genuine ownership. It's perfect, isolated, equipped, removed from the surveillance networks of urban centers. For the first time since leaving the island, Mason allows himself to believe that the immediate threat might be contained. Jessie is recovering physically from her ordeal. She's developing capability in ways that are simultaneously impressive and tragic to observe. She's learning to cook, to recognize when they need to leave, to understand the operational necessities of remaining undiscovered. She's also developing something else, genuine affection for Mason, complicated by the knowledge that his presence in her life is what created the danger she's now enduring. There's a scene in the farmhouse where she asks him directly, "Do you love me?" The question breaks something in Mason. He doesn't have language for what he feels. He was trained to compartmentalize emotion, to suppress attachment, to see feelings as operational liabilities. Love was never a category that existed in his psychological framework. But looking at Jessie, at this girl who has been transformed by proximity to him into something harder and more dangerous than any 14-year-old should become, he understands that whatever this feeling is, it transcends every operational protocol he's ever learned. He tells her the truth. "I don't know how to love anyone. I was trained not to, but I would die for you, and I don't know if that's love, but it's everything I have to give." It's not a redemptive moment. It's a tragic acknowledgement that Mason has become capable of attachment at exactly the moment when attachment has made him completely vulnerable. The breathing room doesn't last. Information that workmen had compiled about Mason before his death, surveillance data, location forecasts, operational patterns, was stored in a system maintained by someone other than Workman himself. A handler named Naomi Aki's character, a woman from the government side of Black Kite's operational structure, discovers this intelligence and realizes that the hunt doesn't need to stop simply because Workman died. The institutional mandate remains: eliminate remaining Black Kite operatives to prevent them from becoming liabilities. She inherits Workman's target list, which now includes Mason's discovered location in the Cotswolds. Naomi Aki brings a different energy to the pursuit. Where Workman was personally invested in catching Mason, where there was psychology and history between them, Aki's character is purely professional. She's not trying to prove anything. She's simply completing an assignment. In some ways, this makes her more dangerous than Workman because she has no ego investment in the outcome. She'll do whatever is necessary without hesitation or second-guessing. She brings a new team to the Cotswolds. This team approaches the farmhouse methodically, carefully, prepared for the possibility that Mason will fight. They don't know that Mason's psychological state has shifted. They don't know that Mason is no longer thinking about his own survival. He's thinking about Jessie's escape. These two priorities are increasingly incompatible. The only way to guarantee Jessie's safety might be to sacrifice his own survival, to create a distraction that allows her to run while he holds the farmhouse against superior numbers. It's a thought he doesn't allow to fully crystallize into decision, but it's there, creating a fissure in his tactical planning. When the team arrives at the farmhouse, Mason doesn't wait for them to breach. He exits the building aggressively, engaging them before they can establish full siege positions. This is tactical suicide. It's also the only way to keep the fight away from the farmhouse, away from Jessie. He tells her to run. He tells her where a vehicle is hidden with money and documents. He tells her a destination in Wales where Schaefer maintains another safe house. He tells her to trust no one except Schaefer. He tells her that he'll follow if he can. He tells her, and this is the moment where everything becomes clear, that his purpose isn't to survive anymore. His purpose is to buy her enough time to become the thing that matters, free. What happens in the firefight that follows is presented in the film with visceral clarity. Mason is extraordinarily capable, but he's also outnumbered. He can kill 2 or 3 operatives, but there are more operatives than he has ammunition for and more time needed to engage them than he has available. He understands that this will end with his death. He's made peace with this. He's accepted it. The question is only whether he buys enough time, whether Jessie makes it to the vehicle, whether his final act as a living person is sufficient to protect her. The answer comes slowly, measured in seconds and gunfire, and the visceral reality of a man choosing death over continuing existence without meaning. Jessie runs. She doesn't look back. She reaches the vehicle. She has the keys. She has the destination. She has everything Mason gave her except the one thing she actually wants, him. But she's learned operational discipline from Mason, and operational discipline means that wanting something and doing what's necessary are often incompatible. She drives. She doesn't know if Mason survived. She doesn't know if she'll ever see him again. She knows only that she must reach Wales, that she must trust Schaefer, that she must survive what came before and hope that survival constitutes meaning. Mason, meanwhile, continues the firefight alone. He's wounded, a bullet in his shoulder, another grazing his ribs. He's running out of ammunition. He's running out of places to move that don't expose him to fire. The tactical situation is deteriorating in real time, but the farmhouse has multiple exits, and Mason knows how to use terrain. He uses the house itself as a weapon, leading operatives through spaces where they're exposed, where he has cover, where superior numbers become less advantageous. He kills another operative, then another, but there are always more, and his ammunition supply is dwindling toward zero. At the moment when it becomes clear that survival is impossible, Mason makes a choice. He retreats into the basement of the farmhouse. He discovers that the basement connects to a tunnel system, probably old, probably built during wartime by someone with paranoia and resources. The tunnel leads under the property and emerges in the woods behind the farmhouse, 50 meters from the main structure. Mason uses this tunnel to escape. It's not a heroic moment. It's pragmatic. It's the choice of someone who has finally learned that survival is sometimes possible even when it seems impossible, that escape doesn't always mean death, that sometimes the way forward is simply the way underneath. He emerges in the woods wounded and exhausted. He can hear operatives searching the farmhouse. He can hear them establishing perimeter positions. He can hear the systematic search that will eventually move outward from the structure. He has perhaps 1 hour before they expand their search area to encompass the surrounding forest. He needs to move. He needs medical attention. He needs resources. But more importantly, he needs to know if Jessie made it. This uncertainty drives everything that follows, because Mason realizes that even if he survives, even if he escapes, his survival means nothing if Jessie didn't make it. She wasn't supposed to be part of this equation. She was supposed to be safe, and his failure to keep her safe, his inability to protect her from the consequences of saving her life, represents the sum total of everything he's become. Not a weapon, not an assassin, not even a man. Simply a failure who took a girl's life and transformed it into something worse than the drowning he saved her from. The film's meditation on what happens after extreme action, after violence, after the moment when all the tactical planning and all the professional training collides with reality and loses, is presented without sentimentality or false comfort. Mason survives the immediate firefight, but survival doesn't equal victory. Survival doesn't equal redemption. Survival is simply the continuation of a consciousness that has become increasingly aware of its own fundamental inadequacy. He moves through the woods. He reaches a small village. He uses cash that Schaefer provided to acquire medical supplies and temporary shelter in a cottage rented by an elderly woman who doesn't ask questions and who accepts payment in cash without requiring identification. Mason treats his own wounds. He's been trained in field medicine, which means he knows how to stop bleeding and prevent infection, but the pain is considerable and the awareness of his own fragility is sharper than it has been in years. He's not invincible. He's not immortal. He's a 58-year-old man with bullet wounds and diminishing resources and a profound uncertainty about whether the girl he tried to protect is still alive. He uses an encrypted phone, a device Schaefer provided specifically for situations requiring untraceable communication, to contact Schaefer and ask a single question. Is she there? The answer comes after what feels like an eternity, but is probably 30 seconds. She arrived yesterday. She's safe. Mason feels something break open inside him. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated. It's the feeling that accompanies the understanding that you have succeeded at something that seemed impossible, but that success has cost you everything, and the remaining question is whether the trade was worthwhile. He has protected Jessie. He has ensured her survival. He has given her resources and training and access to Schaefer's network. She's free. She's safe. She's alive. And Mason is alone in a cottage in the English countryside with bullet wounds and no path forward. The film doesn't offer easy answers to the question it's been posing throughout. Has Mason been redeemed? Has his willingness to die for Jessie transformed him into something other than a weapon? The answer, as Shelter presents it, is both yes and no. Yes, because Mason has genuinely changed. He's become capable of attachment and sacrifice and choosing another person's welfare over his own survival. No, because that transformation doesn't undo the decades of violence. It doesn't erase the lives he took in service to institutional power. It doesn't make him innocent. It simply makes him someone different than he was. And that difference is profound but not redemptive. He is still a killer. He is still an assassin. But he's also now a man willing to die for someone else. And whether that matters is a question the film leaves deliberately unanswered. The tension in this unresolved question, the refusal to provide comfortable closure, is what elevates Shelter beyond standard action fare into something more psychologically complex. 3 weeks pass. Mason doesn't contact anyone. He doesn't move from the cottage. He tells the elderly woman who rented it to him that he's a writer working on a novel, an explanation that satisfies her because it explains his isolation and his unwillingness to engage in social pleasantries. She brings him food. She doesn't ask questions about the bloodstains that required professional cleaning services. She accepts cash payment and maintains a professional distance that allows him the fiction of normalcy while acknowledging its impossibility. His wounds heal more slowly than he anticipated. The bullet that grazed his ribs has created an infection that requires antibiotics he acquires through Schaefer's network, medication that arrives with no paperwork and no traceable connection to any pharmacy. He takes the medication. He sleeps. He reads. He doesn't think about anything except the present moment, which is the first time in his life that he's managed to live in the present without calculating toward the future. This absence of planning is almost meditative. It's also terrifying because planning is what kept him alive for 4 decades. Without planning, without tactical anticipation, he's simply a man in a cottage waiting for something he can't quite articulate. The news eventually reaches him that the Black Kite program has been officially dissolved. Not terminated quietly, but dissolved through proper governmental channels, with announcements and official statements acknowledging that certain historical intelligence operations have ended. The operatives tasked with eliminating remaining personnel have been reassigned. The institutional mandate to kill Mason has been rescinded. He's no longer being hunted. He's simply a ghost, technically alive, officially dead, existing in the spaces between legitimate and illegitimate society. The news brings relief that borders on devastation. He spent weeks preparing himself for continued pursuit. He spent weeks maintaining operational readiness despite his wounds. The removal of that pressure doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like the withdrawal of purpose. What does a weapon do when there's nothing left to defend against? What does a man shaped entirely by threat and response do when the threat vanishes? Mason sits with this question for several days without finding an answer. He contacts Schaefer. He asks where Jessie is. Schaefer tells him that she's in Wales, in the safe house, recovering and adjusting. Schaefer tells him that she's asked about Mason multiple times. Schaefer tells him that Jessie wants to see him. Mason's response is to ask Schaefer not to tell Jessie anything. He tells Schaefer to tell Jessie that Mason is dead. He tells Schaefer to tell Jessie that the closure of the Black Kite program means her life can return to something approximating normal. He tells Schaefer to use resources to establish Jessie with a new identity, new documents, new access to education and opportunity. He tells Schaefer to ensure she's free of him. Schaefer, who has navigated criminal networks for decades and who understands the logic of sacrifice and separation, doesn't argue. He simply says, "You're giving up the only thing that made you human." Mason responds, "That's exactly why I'm giving her away. Because I'm not human. I'm a weapon that learned to care about someone, and the most merciful thing I can do for her is to disappear from her life." What Mason doesn't anticipate is that Jessie is no longer the traumatized girl he rescued from the sea. She's not the adolescent he trained in operational tradecraft. She's become someone harder, someone who has learned that survival requires agency, someone who understands that Mason's attempt to sacrifice himself is a final act of control rather than generosity. She leaves the safe house without authorization. She uses skills that Mason taught her to acquire false documents. She retraces the movements that would lead her back to where Mason disappeared into the English countryside. She doesn't know where he is, but she knows the general area, knows the timeline, knows enough to narrow a search that would defeat anyone without training. It takes her 6 days to find him. She arrives at the cottage in the late afternoon, and Mason opens the door to find her standing on the threshold, a girl who left his presence as a teenager and returned as someone transformed into young adulthood through accelerated exposure to danger and agency. He tells her to leave. He tells her that he's dead, that she needs to continue with the life Schaefer has arranged for her, that his presence will only endanger her. She tells him that she's beyond endangerment. She tells him that she understands what he did, why he did it, and that it was an act of cowardice disguised as sacrifice. She tells him that if he truly cared about her welfare, he would stop trying to control her choices, whether those choices were to stay alive or to find him. She tells him that she's 16 years old and that he taught her how to be dangerous, which means he doesn't get to simultaneously teach her that being free requires abandoning him. It's a confrontation of language and will, not not violence. It's Mason confronting someone he shaped through his own actions and discovering that she's become ungovernable by his intentions. He lets her inside. They sit across from each other at a kitchen table in a cottage where Mason has spent weeks contemplating the possibility of continued existence. She tells him about the safe house. She tells him about the new identity. She tells him that she's refused it. She tells him that she wants to exist in the world as Jessie, not as whoever Schaefer's resources would have constructed for her. She tells him that she understands he's a killer. She understands that his presence in her life is complicated and dangerous and probably damaging in ways she won't understand for years. She tells him that she also understands that without him, she would be dead. Without him, she would be drowning in the same storm that nearly took her life. He saved her. That salvation came at a cost, but she gets to choose whether to accept that cost, and she's choosing acceptance. It's a choice that no 14-year-old should be capable of making with such clarity. But Jessie isn't 14 anymore. She's been aged by experience and by proximity to violence. She's adult in ways that transcend chronology. Mason listens. He doesn't argue. He doesn't try to convince her that his sacrifice would serve her better than his presence. He simply listens, and in that listening, he acknowledges something he spent his life avoiding. Other people matter more than his own survival or his own redemptive narrative. What follows is not a happy ending. Shelter is too sophisticated for happy endings, too aware of the lasting damage that violence causes to pretend that trauma can be overcome through emotional connection and proximity. What follows is something more complicated, a beginning. Mason and Jessie establish a pattern. They don't return to the island. That sanctuary has been compromised and transformed into a location of trauma rather than shelter. Instead, they move, not constantly like they moved before being hunted, but deliberately, establishing semi-permanent bases in different locations across the United Kingdom. Mason uses Schaefer's resources to acquire legitimate employment under one of his false identities. He works as a security consultant, which is technically honest. His security consulting consists of advising businesses about threat assessment and personnel protection, drawing on decades of operational knowledge without requiring him to actually engage in violence anymore. Jessie, meanwhile, pursues formal education through online programs and through contact with tutors that Schaefer carefully vets. She's catching up on the years of education that her orphan status and subsequent trauma disrupted. She's becoming educated in ways that Mason never was, acquiring knowledge that exists in books rather than in operational manuals. They develop what approximates a routine. Mason cooks. Jessie studies. They talk about books and films and the wider world that exists beyond the criminal networks that had consumed Mason's life. They also talk about what happened, the island, the storm, the drowning, Workman's death, the escape. These conversations are difficult. They sometimes involve tears. They sometimes involve anger, particularly when Jessie processes the reality that her childhood was stolen by circumstance and that Mason, for all his sacrifice, contributed to that theft. Mason doesn't defend himself during these conversations. He simply accepts the reality that loving someone and having harmed them are not mutually exclusive, that sacrifice and damage coexist. That redemption, if it exists at all, isn't something that can be achieved through a single dramatic act, but rather through the accumulation of small choices to show up, to listen, to prioritize another person's welfare over one's own comfort. Bill Nighy, in his role as Schaefer, occasionally appears in this section of the narrative, checking in on them, ensuring that their continued existence remains undetected, maintaining the infrastructure of false documents and relocated resources that allows them to move through society without triggering the systems designed to track human movement. Nighy's performance captures the weariness of someone who has spent decades facilitating other people's escapes while never quite managing his own. He looks at Mason and Jessie, and there's sadness in his expression, the sadness of recognizing that they have found something he never could. He tells Mason, "You're going to have to let go of the idea that you're a bad person. You're going to have to accept that good people do bad things, and that doesn't make them permanently corrupted. It makes them human." Mason doesn't believe him, not entirely, but he's learning to live with the belief that Nighy expresses, to move forward despite his fundamental uncertainty about his own moral status. This becomes the film's central mediation, that redemption may not require becoming someone new entirely, but rather integrating the person you were with the person you're becoming. The final act of Shelter shifts the narrative toward resolution without providing easy closure. It returns, symbolically, to the island where the film began, not to stay, but to witness. Mason and Jessie travel back to Scotland together. They stand on the rocks where Jessie nearly drowned, and they acknowledge what that moment cost both of them. The innocence she lost, the isolation Mason surrendered, the trajectory that a single act of compassion created across both their lives. They don't attempt to reclaim the island. They don't try to return to what was. They simply acknowledge that this place place represents the moment where their lives became irrevocably intertwined. Ric Roman Waugh's direction in these final scenes emphasizes space and perspective. The lighthouse stands in the distance, no longer a sanctuary, but rather a symbol of how dramatically circumstances can transform meaning. The rocks are still dangerous. The water is still violent. Nothing has changed about the physical environment. But the two people standing on these rocks are fundamentally different than they were when they first met in this location. Mason, looking at the lighthouse, reflects on the man he was when he occupied that space. He was trying to be nothing, to erase himself through isolation and minimal existence. That version of himself is genuinely gone, but he hasn't been replaced by some redemptive version of Mason who transcends his violence or who becomes purely good. He's simply become someone who carries both the violence and the capacity for attachment simultaneously. He tells Jessie something that serves as the thematic statement of the entire film. The thing about shelter is that it only works if you remember that you're supposed to leave eventually. The point of shelter isn't to hide forever. The point is to gather strength to go back into the world. Jessie responds, "And what if the world is dangerous?" Mason says, "It's always dangerous. The question is whether you're too broken to face it. And I don't think you are. I don't think either of us are anymore." They leave the island together, not as fugitives or as a father and daughter, but as two people who have been fundamentally altered by proximity to each other and who have chosen to continue that proximity anyway. They return to their semi-permanent existence, to Mason's work as a security consultant, to Jessie's continued education, to the accumulation of small moments that constitute a life lived together despite its unconventional foundation. The film's final image is of them driving away from the coast, heading toward the interior of England, toward normalcy that will never be entirely normal, toward the future that extends beyond what either of them could control when their relationship began. It's not redemption in any traditional sense. It's not even a triumphant ending. It's simply the continuation of two people who have learned that survival is sometimes possible even in circumstances designed to prevent it. And that connection, messy, complicated, damaged connection, sometimes matters more than safety. The film ends there, leaving unanswered the question that has driven its entire narrative, whether Mason has been redeemed. The answer, as Shelter ultimately suggests, is that redemption isn't a state that can be achieved. It's a process, ongoing, incomplete, requiring constant reaffirmation, that people undertake when they choose to matter to someone else despite their fundamental doubts about their own worth. Jason Statham's performance in Shelter represents something that most critics dismiss and most audiences don't fully appreciate: the acting of restraint at a level that requires as much skill as expansive emotional performance. Statham has made his career in action films where physicality serves as the primary language, where his body communicates competence and lethality more effectively than his voice ever could. In Shelter, he's required to do something far more difficult: communicate internal transformation through minimal dialogue and controlled effect. The first 40 minutes of the film are almost entirely without words. Statham's character exists in a lighthouse, moving through routines, speaking perhaps 2 sentences per day. The cinematography by Martin Algren emphasizes the geometric spaces of the lighthouse, the circular gallery, the long spiral of stairs, the isolation created by the architectural itself. Statham's performance during these scenes is about presence rather than action. He's establishing the interior life of a man who has learned to be small, to take up minimal space, to exist without disturbing the world around him. It's performance art in a format that most action stars would reject as insufficient. There's no fight choreography, no explosions, no moment where physicality can substitute for emotional depth. But Statham commits to it completely. His face registers only what's necessary. His body moves only when required. He creates through absence what other actors might create through presence. The transformation that occurs as the film progresses, from isolated hermit to protective father figure, isn't accomplished through dialogue or dramatic monologues. It's accomplished through the gradual opening of his face, through the increasing willingness to engage with Jessie, through the minute alterations in posture that suggest someone learning to carry weight on behalf of someone else. By the end of the film, Statham's Mason is physically different from the Mason of the beginning. His shoulders carry more tension. His eyes engage with the world rather than retreat from it. The transformation is subtle enough to miss if you're not paying attention, which is precisely why it's so effective. The cinematography supports this transformation throughout. Algren's work emphasizes the isolation of spaces at the beginning. The lighthouse is almost prison-like, with its confined passages and repetitive verticals. As Mason leaves the island and moves through Scotland, England, and Wales, the cinematography opens up. Landscapes become visible. Other people appear in the frame. The world expands geometrically as Mason's emotional perimeter expands. violence. In the final act, when Mason and Jessie return to the island, the cinematography emphasizes how the physical space hasn't changed, but their relationship to that space has transformed completely. They're no longer trapped. They're choosing to be present. That choice, communicated entirely through framing and composition, represents the entire emotional arc of the film. David Buckley's score is notably restrained. It doesn't attempt to manipulate emotion through orchestral swells or dramatic crescendos. Instead, it creates atmosphere, long, sustained tones that suggest tension without declaring it, minor key compositions that establish unease without demanding response. In the action sequences, the score pulls back rather than escalates, allowing the sound design of violence to communicate impact without musical embellishment. The effect is that viewers experience the film's emotional journey as their own discovery rather than being guided toward prescribed emotional responses. It's a sophisticated approach to scoring that respects the intelligence of the audience. Bodhi Rae Breathnach's performance as Jessie deserves substantially more critical attention than it has received. She carries approximately 50% of the film's emotional weight, and she does it while playing a character who transitions from traumatized orphan to operational asset to young adult capable of independent agency. Most child actors in action films are required to play victimhood. They exist primarily to justify the protagonist's actions through their vulnerability. Breathnach's Jessie refuses this role. She's vulnerable, certainly. She's terrified and confused and traumatized by her near drowning and by the violence that follows. But her vulnerability never becomes passivity. By the middle of the film, she's learning from Mason. By the final act, she's teaching him things about human connection that he couldn't have learned from 4 decades of isolation. Breathnach plays this progression without sentimentality or false notes. Her Jessie never becomes cute or precocious. She simply becomes increasingly competent and increasingly aware of her own agency. The scenes between Statham and Breathnach are remarkable precisely because they resist the conventional action film dynamic where the older male protects the younger female. Instead, they establish a reciprocal relationship where each character is teaching the other something essential. Mason teaches Jessie how to survive in systems designed to eliminate her. Jessie teaches Mason how to live beyond mere survival. Their dialogue is sparse, but it's weighted with meaning. When Jessie asks Mason if he loves her, the scene doesn't play as a dramatic revelation. It plays as a child asking a legitimate question and receiving an honest answer that acknowledges the impossibility of the situation while simultaneously affirming its truth. Breathnach's response to Mason's honesty, accepting his limitation while accepting his commitment, demonstrates that she's understood something about the nature of love that transcends romance. It's the willingness to be present despite fundamental inadequacy. Bill Nighy Schaefer appears in only approximately 20 minutes of screen time, but his presence is consequential. Nighy plays Schaefer as a man who exists in the margins of legitimate and illegitimate systems, facilitating other people's escapes while never quite managing his own. There's melancholy in Nighy's interpretation that's never explicitly stated but always present. The sadness of someone who has learned to survive by maintaining distance, watching Mason and Jessie develop connection, and recognizing what he sacrificed to stay alive. In a brief scene late in the film, when Schaefer tells Mason that he's going to have to let go of the idea that he's a bad person, Nighy delivers the line with the weight of someone speaking from experience, someone who has spent decades trying to believe his own advice and only partially succeeding. His final appearance in the film, a brief check-in at a cafe in rural England where he brings Jessie identification documents, is quiet and understated, but it carries the emotional resonance of closure for a character who was always going to remain peripheral. Daniel Mays, playing Naomi Ackie's handler opposite her character, and Harriet Walter as an agency official, occupy smaller roles but contribute to the film's sense that Mason and Jessie are being hunted by institutional machinery rather than individual antagonists. Their professional distance makes them more threatening than Workman's personal investment ever could. They represent the system itself, impersonal and relentless. This systemic threat creates the true antagonist of the film, not individual characters, but the institutional logic that treats human beings as administrative problems. What separates Shelter from standard action thrillers is its willingness to engage with the psychological consequences of violence rather than simply presenting violence as spectacle. Ric Roman Waugh, directing his second collaboration with Jason Statham, demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of how violence marks people, not just physically, but psychologically. The violence in Shelter is presented with consequences. When Mason kills someone, there's weight to it. When he's wounded, the wounds don't heal through montage and resolve to continue fighting. They hurt, they impair, they create ongoing limitation. The film's most powerful sequences aren't the action beats themselves, but the quiet moments that follow violence. Mason sitting alone, processing what he's done. Jessie processing what she's witnessed. Both characters understanding that the removal of one threat has created the conditions for new difficulties. The screenplay by Ward Parry is fundamentally interested in the question of whether people can change their essential nature. Mason was trained to be a killer. That training doesn't disappear when he decides to stop killing. His reflexes remain deadly. His tactical thinking remains lethal. His capacity for violence remains undiminished. But he chooses, repeatedly and with increasing consistency, not to deploy those capabilities except in defense of Jessie. The screenplay doesn't suggest that this choice constitutes redemption. It simply chronicles the choice, acknowledges its cost, and explores what it means to be someone trapped between the person you were trained to become and the person you're attempting to be. This is far more interesting terrain than typical action narratives explore, which tend to present character transformation as completion. A character overcomes their flaw and becomes better. Shelter presents transformation as incomplete and ongoing, a process requiring constant reaffirmation. There's a scene late in the film where Mason and Jessie are at a cafe in a small market town, and Jessie is studying for an examination while Mason reads a newspaper. To outside observers, they appear to be an ordinary man and girl, perhaps father and daughter, engaged in ordinary life. But the film understands what they cost to create that image. The training, the violence, the sacrifices, the compromises with truth and legitimacy required to exist in this space. The film doesn't pretend that this moment is redemptive, that reaching normalcy washes away the violence that preceded it. It simply presents the moment, allowing viewers to feel whatever complexity emerges from witnessing two people trying to build life from trauma. Waugh's directorial approach emphasizes human moments over action sequences. This is not a typical choice for action directors, who often treat character moments as filler between set pieces. But Waugh, perhaps drawing on his experience directing films like Greenland where disaster provides context for human decisions, uses action sequences as punctuation in a narrative primarily concerned with emotional and psychological states. The effect is that violence interrupts the film rather than defining it. The film is fundamentally about Mason and Jessie's relationship, with violence functioning as the mechanism through which that relationship deepens and transforms. The editing by Matthew Newman contributes significantly to the film's pacing and its management of tension. Early in the film, editing is minimal. Scenes breathe. Transitions are simple. Time moves with the unhurried quality of someone living in isolation. As the hunt intensifies, editing becomes more aggressive. Cuts quicken. Montages compress time. The rhythm of the film literally accelerates as the pressure on Mason and Jessie mounts. By the climactic farmhouse sequence, editing reaches a peak of intensity, with rapid cuts establishing action and chaos. But critically, after Mason escapes, after the immediate threat resolves, editing slows again. This isn't a flaw in the editing. It's intentional. The film wants viewers to experience the same deceleration that Mason experiences, the same shift from action-oriented consciousness to reflection. In the final act, when the threat has been removed and Mason and Jessie are establishing their new life, editing returns to the unhurried pace of the opening sequences. This creates a circular structure that suggests that what Mason has learned in the film is precisely how to live slowly, how to exist without constant threat, how to be present in moments without calculating toward future danger. The cinematographic choices, the use of natural light, the emphasis on landscape and interior space, the minimal use of artificial lighting, create a palette that feels lived in rather than stylized. Most action films employ high contrast, saturated cinematography that makes violence visually exciting. Shelter uses muted colors and naturalistic lighting, which makes violence uncomfortable rather than entertaining. When Mason kills someone, it doesn't look heroic. It looks like what it is, a person ending another person's life. This tonal choice creates cognitive dissonance for viewers accustomed to action films where violence functions as entertainment. Shelter forces viewers to confront the reality of violence rather than escape into fantasy of it. The result is that viewers understand at a deeper level what Mason's actions cost him psychologically, even if they cost him nothing physically. This is perhaps the film's most significant achievement. It uses cinema to communicate the psychological reality of violence in ways that most action films refuse to attempt. By the end of Shelter, viewers understand not just what happened in the plot, but what those events did to the people experiencing them. That understanding, that emotional and psychological integration of action and consequence, is what elevates Shelter beyond standard action fare into something more genuinely complex. The central thematic preoccupation of Shelter is deceptively simple on the surface, but extraordinarily complex in its execution. Can someone fundamentally fundamentally reshape their nature through deliberate choice? Or is nature something fixed that can only be suppressed, never truly transformed? This question has been explored in cinema before. It's the core question of Luc Besson's Leon, released in 1994, a film about an assassin protecting a young girl that Shelter inevitably invokes through its own structure. But where Leon ultimately suggests that redemption is impossible, where Matilda's survival comes at the cost of Leon's death, and his death is presented as necessary for her freedom, Shelter proposes something different. Redemption isn't a state achieved, but a process engaged. It's the accumulation of small choices to be present, to listen, to prioritize another person's welfare, to accept limitation rather than pursuing unlimited capability. This is not the same as becoming good. It's simply the decision to stop being the person institutional violence shaped you into, even if you can never fully become someone other than that person. Mason, at the end of Shelter, is not redeemed. He's not innocent. He hasn't overcome his capacity for violence or his trained instinct to assess situations through tactical frameworks. What has changed is his commitment. He's committed to using his capability toward protection rather than elimination, to serving Jessie's welfare rather than his own survival agenda. This commitment isn't stable or permanent. It's constantly tested. The film implies through its final scenes that Mason's transformation remains perpetually incomplete. He's going to spend the rest of his life managing the contradiction between what he is and what he's chosen to become. The film's refusal to provide redemptive resolution is actually its greatest thematic strength. Most narratives involving reformed killers provide a moment of cathartic transformation where the character proves they've truly changed, a moment of sacrifice, a final act of heroism, something that definitively demonstrates inner transformation. Shelter refuses this catharsis. Mason survives. Jessie survives. They continue together. But the film ends without providing certainty that Mason's transformation is permanent or complete. This uncertainty is closer to psychological truth than any redemptive narrative could be. Real trauma isn't overcome through dramatic moments. It's managed through daily choices, repeated commitment, and the constant negotiation between who you were and who you're trying to become. The film's thematic depth emerges from its refusal to simplify this process. Shelter is also, beneath its surface narrative about violence and protection, a film about identity formation under extreme circumstances. Mason's identity prior to the film consists of professional designation. He's Michael Masso, assassin, tool, precision instrument. He has no personal identity outside of his functionality to institutional power. The entire first act is about the impossibility of having a personal identity when you're designed purely for function. Jessie's identity, meanwhile, is destroyed by circumstance. Orphaned, she has no family identity, limited social identity, minimal personal history. She exists primarily as orphan, as vulnerable girl, as someone whose identity is defined by absence. What the film explores is the possibility of building identity through relationship rather than through external designation or circumstance. Mason becomes someone through his relationship with Jessie, not a killer anymore, though he remains capable of killing, not a government asset anymore, though he remains shaped by government training. He becomes a man with responsibility to another person, and that responsibility becomes the foundation of his new identity. Similarly, Jessie becomes someone through her relationship with Mason, not merely an orphan defined by loss, but a young woman with agency, capability, and choice. Their identities are constructed through connection rather than despite it. The comparative framework is useful for understanding what Shelter accomplishes that similar films don't. Leon explores similar territory, an assassin protecting a girl, but Leon is fundamentally a film about the romance of violence. Matilda is romanticized as a young woman seduced into the world of killing by a man she loves. Her development is tragic precisely because she becomes what Leon made her. Shelter, by contrast, resists the romance of violence entirely. Mason doesn't seduce Jessie into becoming dangerous. He reluctantly trains her in survival because circumstances force it. The film constantly interrogates whether that training was appropriate, whether Mason harmed Jessie through his instruction, whether his protection came at the cost of her innocence. It doesn't resolve these questions, which is exactly the right choice. The Bourne films, meanwhile, explore violence as a psychological wound. Jason Bourne struggles with his identity as an assassin, struggles to remember who he was before violence consumed his life. Shelter accepts that Mason will never return to a pre-violent state of innocence because that state didn't exist. He was violent even before institutional training. That's why he was recruited. The question isn't how to undo violence, but how to redirect it. This is a more mature understanding of trauma and transformation. Most action films featuring reformed killers present violence as something that can be overcome, escaped, abstract, transcended. Shelter suggests instead that violence, once it's become part of your cognitive and physical wiring, doesn't disappear. It can be managed, it can be redirected, it can be controlled, but it doesn't vanish. This is why Mason's final relationship with Jessie is both genuine and complicated. He loves her, if we define love as the willingness to die for her. But that love is expressed through the framework of someone trained to think tactically about threat, to assess situations for danger, to anticipate violence. Mason's love isn't uncomplicated. It's the love of someone whose psychological framework has been shaped by decades of institutional violence, now attempting to apply that framework toward protection instead of elimination. Where Shelter truly differentiates itself from comparable films is in its refusal to romanticize either the violence or the protection. Violence isn't presented as exciting or entertaining. It's presented as a necessity that damages everyone it touches. Protection isn't presented as heroic. It's presented as a responsibility that costs the protector everything they're trying to build for themselves. The film offers no moral certainty. Mason protecting Jessie isn't obviously right or wrong. It creates danger that wouldn't exist without him. It also creates meaning that wouldn't exist without him. These two realities coexist. Most action narratives would resolve this ambiguity by making one clearly wrong and one clearly right. Shelter maintains the ambiguity throughout. This ambiguity is what makes the film psychologically sophisticated. It forces viewers to develop their own moral framework rather than having the film's framework imposed upon them. The symbolic architecture of Shelter operates at multiple levels, beginning with the title word itself, shelter. A shelter is supposed to provide safety. It's supposed to be a space where threat is diminished, where vulnerability can exist without triggering catastrophe. The lighthouse initially functions as shelter for Mason, a space removed from the world, removed from threat, removed from institutional reach. But the film demonstrates that shelter is only meaningful when temporary. Staying in shelter forever isn't safety. It's a slow death through isolation and disconnection. Jessie's near drowning violates the sanctuary of the lighthouse, shattering the illusion that retreat from the world provides true safety. This is the film's central symbolic statement. Shelter is never truly safe because safety is impossible in a world of human violence and institutional power. The island itself functions as a symbol of the fantasy of complete separation from threat. Islands are surrounded by water. They're literally separated from other people, from systems, from institutional reach. They're paradise in the mythological sense, a space removed from the complications of civilization. But Mason's Island isn't paradise. It's purgatory, a space of ongoing punishment masked as retreat. The film uses the geography of islands to suggest that geographic separation doesn't provide psychological safety. Mason has removed himself from London and from the institutional systems that hunted him, but he hasn't removed himself from the internal architecture of those systems, from the tactical thinking, the operational awareness, the psychological framework of someone trained to be a weapon. The water surrounding the island represents both protection and danger. It prevents workmen from approaching easily, but it also nearly kills Jessie, and it ultimately cannot be crossed to escape together with full safety. The lighthouse functions as the archetypal symbol of guidance and warning. Lighthouses exist to prevent ships from crashing on rocks. They provide orientation in darkness. But Mason's lighthouse is reversed. Instead of guiding people away from danger, it draws them toward it. Workman arrives at the lighthouse, searching for Mason. Jessie nearly drowns while Mason is tending the lighthouse. The structure designed to protect becomes the structure that enables danger. This symbolic reversal suggests that protection itself is always complicated, that the attempt to provide safety can create the conditions for harm. The countryside through which Mason and Jessie flee, Scotland, Wales, the rural interior of England, represents authentic space as opposed to the artificial space of institutions. But the countryside is not presented as sanctuary. It's presented as space that provides concealment without providing actual safety. Workman finds them in the countryside as efficiently as anywhere else. The film suggests that there's no escape into authenticity that will provide safety from systemic threat. Finally, the final image of Mason and Jessie driving away from the coast represents movement toward the interior, movement away from boundary and separation toward the center of civilization. It's not an escape from threat. It's an acceptance that threat exists everywhere, and their choice is to continue anyway, building life in the spaces between danger. What Shelter ultimately argues, through every structural and thematic choice, is that the question isn't whether Mason can escape violence or become good or achieve redemption. The question is whether he can choose connection despite knowing he's fundamentally dangerous, and whether Jessie can choose to continue that connection despite knowing its cost. This is the film's most radical thematic statement. Redemption isn't about overcoming who you are. It's about accepting who you are and choosing to matter to someone anyway. This reframes redemption entirely. It's not a moral achievement. It's an act of acceptance combined with commitment. Mason accepts that he's a killer. He accepts that his presence creates danger. He accepts that he can't transform his nature. But he chooses to commit to Jessie's welfare anyway, and that choice, repeated daily, tested constantly, never fully resolved, becomes the substance of his life. Similarly, Jessie accepts that Mason is damaged and dangerous, and that his protection might harm her. But she chooses to continue the relationship anyway, because Mason's presence also provides something essential, proof that connection is possible even between fundamentally broken people. The psychological sophistication of Shelter lies in this understanding, that love and safety aren't dependent on the beloved being good or safe. Love is the choice to be present with someone despite their danger. It's the commitment to matter to someone despite mutual inadequacy. This is far more mature than typical redemption narratives, which suggest that love requires the beloved to transform into someone safe, someone good, someone worthy. Shelter suggests instead that love requires accepting someone despite their danger, loving them not in spite of their darkness, but alongside it. The film also understands something fundamental about institutional violence that most action films avoid. Institutions don't create violence. They organize violence. They systemize violence. They provide framework for violence that would exist anyway. Mason was violent before Black Kite recruited him. That's why he was useful to Black Kite. Conversely, leaving Black Kite doesn't make him nonviolent. It simply removes the institutional structure that directed his violence. This is why Workman can hunt him down, because Workman understands that Mason's capability hasn't changed, only the institutional context has. The film's understanding of this psychological reality, the human capacity for violence is fundamentally independent of institutional framework, is what makes it more sophisticated than films that suggest violence can be escaped or transcended. Shelter accepts the tragic reality that some people will always be capable of extraordinary violence, and the meaningful question isn't how to make them incapable of violence, but how to direct that capacity toward protection and connection rather than destruction. This is a mature understanding of human psychology and institutional power. Beneath Shelter's surface narrative about assassination and protection lies a sophisticated meditation on what toxic masculinity is and how it differs from masculine strength. This distinction is crucial and often missed in contemporary discussions about gender and power. Toxic masculinity isn't strength. It's the performance of strength divorced from vulnerability, connection, or genuine responsibility. A man shaped entirely by institutional violence, trained to see himself as tool, to suppress emotion, to prioritize survival over relationship, embodies toxic masculinity not because he's strong, but because he's learned to mistake emotional disconnection for power. Mason's entire first act, before Jessie nearly drowns, is a portrait of toxic masculinity. He's isolated, he's controlled, he's removed from human vulnerability. He's achieved the masculine ideal as defined by systems of power, complete autonomy, complete self-sufficiency, complete lack of dependency or attachment. And he's miserable. The film suggests that this kind of masculine autonomy is actually profound weakness disguised as strength. Real strength, the film proposes, requires vulnerability. It requires the willingness to need someone else. It requires the acceptance that your own survival might be less important than another person's welfare. This is genuinely transgressive for action cinema, which typically celebrates male autonomy and independence. Shelter suggests instead that true masculine strength is expressed through commitment despite inadequacy, through presence despite danger, through the acceptance that loving someone makes you fundamentally vulnerable. Mason's transformation isn't about becoming softer or less capable. It's about recognizing that capability without connection is just institutional violence wearing a human face. The scenes that best exemplify this redefinition of masculinity are the quiet moments rather than the action sequences. There's a moment where Mason teaches Jessie to cook, something he learned in isolation on the island out of pure necessity. The scene has no plot function. Nothing happens that advances the story. But Mason is teaching Jessie something practical, something that enables her independence, something that's about care rather than control. He's not trying to protect her by keeping her dependent. He's trying to protect her by making her capable. This is masculine strength redefined, not the ability to overpower, but the willingness to enable another person's power. Similarly, there's a scene where Jessie is studying and Mason sits across from her, reading. They're simply present with each other in domestic space. Neither is performing for the other. Neither is trying to prove anything. They're just existing together. For an action film, this scene is revolutionary. It suggests that masculine meaning doesn't come from action or dominance, but from presence and attention. action. The film also refuses to romanticize Mason's violence as masculine strength. When he kills Workman, the scene is brutal and ugly. It doesn't look like victory. It looks like what it is, a man ending another man's life. There's no glory in it. There's no moral clarity justifying it. It's simply the cost of protecting someone else. By refusing to aestheticize this violence, the film refuses to celebrate it as an expression of masculine power. Instead, it presents it as tragic necessity, something Mason does because he has no other choice, but something that damages him even as it accomplishes its objective. This is perhaps the film's most important statement about masculinity, that even when violence is justified, even when it's necessary, it's still damaging. It still costs something. And a mature masculine ethics acknowledges that cost rather than pretending violence is empowering or heroic. There are several specific scenes that crystallize the film's entire thematic project and deserve individual attention for how perfectly they exemplify what Shelter is trying to communicate. The first is the scene where Jessie asks Mason if he loves her. This scene is quiet, conversational, almost thrown away by the narrative structure. Jessie asks directly, "Do you love me?" It's not a dramatic moment. It's a question asked by a girl to a man she depends on, seeking confirmation that their relationship is genuine. Most action films would handle this through either full affirmation or dramatic denial. Mason's response is neither. He says, "I don't know how to love anyone. I was trained not to, but I would die for you, and I don't know if that's love, but it's everything I have to give." This response is extraordinary because it's honest about limitation while simultaneously affirming commitment. It's saying, "I cannot guarantee that what I feel meets your definition of love because I don't have the psychological framework to feel love in conventional ways. But my commitment to your welfare is absolute." Is that love? I'm genuinely uncertain, but it's the only love I'm capable of offering. This honesty, this refusal to provide false comfort through claiming to experience emotions he's not sure he experiences, is what makes Mason's character genuinely redeemed in a way that redemptive narratives typically fail to achieve. He's not pretending to be something he's not. He's accepting what he is while committing to someone else anyway. The second scene is the farmhouse confrontation with Workman. Before they fight, they have a conversation. Workman tells Mason that this is futile, that the system will always send people, that there's no escaping institutional violence. Mason responds that he's not trying to escape. He's trying to buy time. He's trying to ensure Jessie gets away. Workman calls this futile. Mason says, "Maybe, but I'm going to try anyway." The scene is important because it presents two completely trained operatives reaching the same operational conclusion, that Mason can't win, but choosing different responses. Workman chooses to complete his assignment. Mason chooses to sacrifice himself for Jessie. The choice isn't presented as obviously moral or righteous. It's simply presented as a choice between two understandable positions. Workman's position is reasonable. Institutions are more powerful than individuals. Mason's position is also reasonable. Some things matter more than survival. The film doesn't privilege one over the other. It simply shows them existing and accepts the tragic reality that their mutual reasonableness leads to violence and death. The third scene is Jessie finding Mason after he's tried to disappear from her life. She arrives at his cottage, and she doesn't accept his argument that he's dead or that she needs to move on without him. She tells him directly that she chooses him, complications and all. This scene is also revolutionary for action cinema because it reverses the typical dynamic where the male protagonist makes choices about the female character's welfare. Here, the young woman makes an active choice about her own life and her own relationship. She's not being rescued. She's rescuing the relationship that Mason is trying to end. It's a moment of genuine female agency in a genre often structured around male agency and female vulnerability. These three scenes, each quiet, each dialogue-driven, each focused on emotional and psychological complexity rather than action, represent the core of what makes Shelter sophisticated cinema rather than standard action fare. Shelter arrives in 2026 at a moment when audiences are experiencing significant fatigue with the standard action film formula. Former operative lives quiet life, is pulled back into violence, must use his skills to protect someone or achieve some objective, and emerges transformed by the experience. This formula has been deployed so consistently across the decade that it's become almost invisible. Audiences expect it so thoroughly that variations register as innovative simply by acknowledging their own repetitiveness. Shelter functions brilliantly within this context precisely because it accepts the formula without pretending it's anything more than formula. The film knows it's a Jason Statham action film. The final moments of Shelter show Mason and Jessie in a vehicle driving away from the Scottish coast, heading inland toward the interior of England where they've established their semi-permanent existence. They're not running anymore. They're moving towards something rather than away from something. The camera pulls back, showing the landscape expanding, expanding, mountains giving way to hills, coast giving way to countryside, the physical boundaries of the island replaced by the open space of the mainland. It's a visual representation of expanding possibility. The Black Kite program has been officially dissolved. Workman is dead. The immediate threat that drove the entire narrative is gone. But Mason and Jessie remain changed by that threat in ways that can't be undone. They're not happy. They're not triumphant. But they're moving forward together, which is the film's only available definition of victory. The final image freezes on them driving, neither speaking, simply existing together in the cab of the vehicle. The score, David Buckley's restrained composition, doesn't swell. It simply continues, a sustained note that suggests ongoing process rather than resolution. This final image is the film's statement about the nature of survival and connection. There is no arrival point. There is only continuation. There is only the daily choice to matter to someone despite fundamental inadequacy. The interpretation of this ending, what it actually means rather than what it shows, requires understanding that Shelter is fundamentally a film about the possibility of meaning in a world structured by institutional violence and trauma. The ending doesn't suggest that Mason and Jessie have escaped or overcome or transcended their circumstances. It suggests that they've accepted those circumstances while choosing to build meaning anyway. Mason will likely spend the rest of his life managing the psychological architecture that institutional training created. Jessie will likely spend the rest of her life processing the acceleration of her childhood into premature adulthood. But they'll do these things together, which means they won't do them alone, which means the suffering will be distributed and therefore slightly more bearable. The ending is saying, this is not a happy ending. This is a survivable ending. This is an ending where two broken people choose to continue being broken together rather than trying to isolate their brokenness. The film's interpretation of redemption, the final argument it makes about Mason's transformation, is that redemption isn't salvation. It's integration. Mason hasn't been saved from violence or trauma. He's integrated his capacity for violence and his trauma into a life where that capacity serves protection rather than elimination, where that trauma is acknowledged rather than denied. He's become whole not by overcoming his darkness, but by accepting it while choosing to direct it toward connection. This is the film's most radical claim, that wholeness isn't possible through redemption in the traditional sense. It's possible only through acceptance combined with commitment. You don't overcome who you are. You accept who you are and choose what to do with that self. This is far more mature and far more tragic than typical redemptive narratives, which suggest that transformation is achievable, that the past can be overcome, that redemption provides closure and completion. Shelter suggests instead that redemption is a process, ongoing, incomplete, requiring constant recommitment, and that process is the only meaningful definition of transformation available to people shaped by trauma. The central themes of Shelter operate at multiple registers, each building on the others to create a coherent statement about what it means to be human in systems designed to reduce humans to instrumental purpose. The primary theme is the question of whether institutional violence can be escaped. The answer the film provides is, institutionally, yes. Mason can leave the Black Kite program. The program can be officially dissolved. But psychologically, the answer is no. Institutional violence inscribes itself into the nervous system, into the cognitive architecture, into the fundamental way a person processes the world. Mason will never process danger like an ordinary person. He'll never stop seeing situations through tactical frameworks. He'll never fully escape the training that shaped him. The film accepts this tragedy without proposing solutions or false hope. The secondary theme is what connection means to someone fundamentally shaped by disconnection. Mason spent 40 years learning to suppress attachment, to treat relationships as liabilities, to prioritize survival over anything resembling love. That 40 years of training doesn't disappear when he decides to protect Jessie. But what the film suggests is that genuine human connection isn't dependent on perfect emotional health or psychological wholeness. It's dependent on commitment despite inadequacy. Jessie doesn't require Mason to be healed or whole. She requires only that he show up and that he matter to her, which he does. The tertiary theme is the nature of protection and its inevitable complications. To protect someone, you must inevitably expose them to new dangers, the dangers inherent in connection with you. Mason protecting Jessie means Jessie is pursued by workmen, nearly killed in the farmhouse, forced into accelerated maturity. The protection creates the danger it's designed to prevent. The film asks, is this protection? Is it love? Is it harm? And the answer, as Shelter presents it, is all of these simultaneously. Protection in a world of institutional violence is always complicated. It always carries costs, and those costs might be worth paying, but they shouldn't be minimized or denied. The quaternary theme is identity formation through relationship rather than designation or circumstance. Mason's identity before the film is institutional designation. He's Michael Masso, a tool. Jessie's identity before the film is circumstantial designation. She's an orphan, a victim. Neither has personal identity independent of external category. Through their relationship, both develop identities independent of external designation. Mason becomes a man with responsibility to another person. Jessie becomes a young woman with agency and choice. These identities aren't imposed. They're built through daily interaction and mutual commitment. The film's thematic statement about identity is that it's not something you achieve or accomplish. It's something you construct through connection with other people who matter to you. Finally, the film engages with the theme of what survival actually means. Survival isn't escape from threat. Survival isn't achieving safety. Survival is learning to continue despite threat, building meaning despite danger, mattering to someone even when you're fundamentally broken. By the final act, Mason and Jessie have survived, not because the danger has ended, but because they've learned to continue anyway. They've learned that survival doesn't require happiness or triumph or redemption. It requires only the daily choice to continue together, which is the most meaningful definition of survival available to people in their circumstances. The film's story, evaluated on its own merits as a narrative about protection and pursuit, works effectively within its chosen framework. The plot progresses logically from inciting incident, the rescue, through escalating complications, the hunt, to climactic confrontation, workman, to resolution, escape, and new life. Each story beat follows from the previous one with cause and effect that feels earned rather than contrived. The screenplay makes intelligent use of the confined geography of the British Isles. Mason and Jessie can't fly internationally easily, which forces them to move through a constrained space where workmen can pursue methodically. This geographic limitation serves the story by creating inevitable confrontation rather than allowing indefinite escape. The pacing of the story across its 107 minutes feels appropriate for the material. The opening act establishes Mason's isolation without rushing. The second act develops the threat and the relationship between Mason and Jessie with time for character development. The third act delivers action and confrontation, but critically, it doesn't end there. The film provides a fourth act of recovery and processing, which is rare in action cinema, and which gives the story genuine depth. The characters, evaluated on their psychological complexity and consistency, are remarkably well developed for an action film. Mason's arc from isolation to connection is gradual and earned. He doesn't suddenly become capable of emotional attachment. He slowly develops commitment through repeated choice and through Jessie's persistent presence. Jessie's arc from traumatized girl to capable young woman is accelerated but believable, given the extraordinary circumstances. The supporting characters, Workman, Schaefer, the handler, are each psychologically coherent and motivated. Workman isn't evil. He's simply a man completing an assignment he believes is legitimate. Schaefer isn't villainous. He's a man who has chosen survival through distance and who recognizes in Mason something different. The direction by Ric Roman Waugh is sophisticated and restrained. The film avoids stylistic flourishes that would distract from the emotional content. The framing is clean and purposeful. The camera movement serves story and character rather than drawing attention to itself. The action sequences are choreographed for clarity rather than spectacle. Viewers can understand what's happening and why it matters. This is technically excellent direction that prioritizes communication over virtuosity. The cinematography by Martin Algren creates a visual language that reflects the story's progression. Early scenes are cool-toned and minimal, reflecting Mason's isolation. As the film progresses, color begins to enter the frame. By the final act, the cinematography is warmer and more welcoming, reflecting Mason and Jessie's emergence into authentic life. The film's visual language, the grammar of color, composition, and framing, serves the thematic content throughout. However, there is one specific weakness in the film that deserves acknowledgement. The character of Naomi Ackie's handler lacks sufficient development. She arrives midway through as a replacement for Workman, but she's never given the psychological specificity that Workman received. We understand Workman's personal investment in catching Mason. We understand his psychology. Naomi Ackie's character is simply a professional representative of institutional cold logic. This is thematically useful. She represents the impersonal nature of institutional violence, but it makes her less interesting as a character and less compelling as an antagonist. The final confrontation with her operatives doesn't carry the same weight as the Workman confrontation because we haven't been given access to her interiority. She remains a function rather than a person. This is the film's most significant structural weakness. The replacement antagonist lacks the psychological dimension that would make the escalated threat feel genuinely personal rather than simply institutional. Evaluating appreciating the film's emotional impact requires understanding what emotional response it's designed to create. Shelter is not designed to inspire triumph or catharsis. It's designed to create recognition. The recognition that survival in systems of institutional violence is possible, but only at cost. That connection is possible even between broken people, but only through commitment. That meaning can be built in the aftermath of trauma, but only through daily choice. The emotional journey the film creates is bittersweet rather than triumphant. Viewers emerge from Shelter not exhilarated but moved. They've been given something to process, not just the story, but the emotional truth that the story contains. The film earns its emotional moments through restraint rather than manipulation. It doesn't manipulate tears or force sentiment. It simply shows people in genuine situations making choices about connection and allows viewers to feel whatever emerges from witnessing that. By the final act, when Mason tells Jessie that he doesn't know how to love but would die for her, the moment lands because it's been earned through 2 hours of careful character work. The emotion isn't imposed. It emerges naturally from understanding these characters' trajectories. The overall verdict on Shelter is that it's a sophisticated, thoughtful action film that takes its themes and its audience seriously. It succeeds as entertainment. The action sequences are competently executed. The pacing maintains engagement. The narrative propels forward. But more importantly, it succeeds as cinema, as a medium communicating psychological and emotional truths about trauma, connection, and the possibility of meaning in a damaged world. The film is not perfect. The second antagonist lacks sufficient development. There are moments where the exposition feels slightly forced. Some viewers will find the quiet moments slow and the refusal of redemptive closure unsatisfying. But the film's achievements outweigh its limitations. It's a film that respects its audience's intelligence. It's a film willing to leave questions unanswered. It's a film that suggests love and protection and survival are complicated, ongoing processes rather than destinations achieved. It's a film that argues for the possibility of connection despite fundamental brokenness. These are significant achievements in contemporary action cinema. The film's recommendation is clear. Watch it if you appreciate action cinema that takes psychological and emotional depth seriously. Watch it if you're interested in alternative models of masculinity and redemption. Watch it if you want to see a film that refuses false comfort while maintaining genuine hope about the possibility of human connection. The film's uncompromising vision and sophisticated execution make it a worthwhile experience for viewers willing to meet it on its own terms. Shelter is 2026 Shelter 2026 analysis breakdown ending explained, and what it ultimately communicates is that survival isn't about overcoming who you are. It's about accepting who you are and choosing to matter to someone anyway, despite knowing that matching will cost you everything and that it's still worth the cost. Shelter is specifically crafted for viewers who have moved beyond the standard action film formula and who are seeking cinema that respects their intellectual and emotional sophistication. This is not a film for everyone, and it shouldn't pretend to be. If you approach Shelter expecting the Jason Statham action hero vehicle, expecting rapid-fire pacing, cartoonish villains, victories that resolve conflict, you will be disappointed. The film moves slowly in its opening act. It prioritizes character development over action. It refuses to provide moral certainty or redemptive closure. These choices will frustrate viewers seeking straightforward entertainment, but they will profoundly resonate with viewers seeking something deeper. Specifically, Shelter appeals to audiences who appreciated the psychological complexity of films like Sicario, where violence is presented as systemic and psychologically damaging rather than entertaining. It appeals to viewers who valued the character-focused storytelling of Hell or High Water, where relationship and psychology matter more than action spectacle. It appeals to those who connected with the ambiguous masculinity of films like The Lighthouse, where traditional masculine codes are questioned and deconstructed. It appeals to audiences who were moved by the parent-child dynamics of films like Logan, where protection is complicated by the protector's fundamental danger. If you found meaning in any of these films, if you appreciated their refusal of easy answers and their commitment to psychological authenticity, Shelter will resonate with you. The film is also specifically for viewers interested in exploring alternative models of masculinity and redemption. There's been increased critical and cultural conversation about toxic masculinity, about what healthy masculine strength might look like, about how men shaped by institutional violence might learn to be something other than instruments of that violence. Shelter engages directly with these questions through Mason's arc. If you've been thinking about these issues, about how masculinity is constructed, about what vulnerability means, about how commitment to another person can constitute strength, this film will deepen and complicate your thinking. The film also speaks directly to viewers who have experienced trauma or who have loved someone with trauma. There's a specificity to how Shelter portrays the ongoing reality of trauma, the way it doesn't disappear, the way it becomes part of your nervous system, the way building life despite trauma requires daily choice, that will feel authentic to people with lived experience of these dynamics. The film doesn't pretend trauma can be overcome or transcended. It accepts trauma as permanent while exploring whether meaning can be built anyway. This is profoundly different from most mainstream cinema, which tends toward either complete denial of trauma's permanence or complete tragedy, where trauma destroys all meaning. Shelter proposes a third option. Trauma is permanent and meaning is still possible. For viewers in that space, people who are building lives in the aftermath of trauma, people who are learning to love despite brokenness, people who understand that wholeness isn't possible but continuation is, this film will feel like it was made specifically for them. The film is also for film scholars and critics interested in how action cinema can be elevated through psychological sophistication and thematic complexity. Shelter demonstrates that commercial action films don't have to sacrifice meaning for accessibility, that working within genre conventions doesn't preclude thematic depth, that audiences interested in entertainment and audiences interested in meaning aren't actually different audiences. They're the same audience with overlapping interests. The film will appeal to viewers who think about cinema as art form while still enjoying action as entertainment. If you're watching film reviews and analysis because you want to think deeply about how cinema works, how stories are told, how filmmakers communicate through technique and performance and editing, Shelter will give you plenty to think about. The streaming availability of Shelter places it within reach of audiences globally, though availability varies by region and changes over time. In the United States, the film is currently available on multiple platforms depending on subscription status, making it accessible to viewers with standard streaming access. In the United Kingdom, where the film is set and where much of the narrative unfolds, it's available through primary distribution channels. In other regions, availability through legal streaming services varies, though the film's theatrical release was wide enough that physical media copies are available in most markets. For viewers outside standard streaming ecosystems, the film is worth seeking out, either through theatrical presentation if it reaches your market, through rental options if available, or through acquisition if the film speaks to your interests. This is a film worth the effort to locate because its themes and its execution deserve engagement on the largest screen and with the best audio quality available. Theatrical viewing is the ideal experience, but the film's intimate character moments remain powerful even on smaller screens. The film's pacing and visual language are sophisticated enough that they benefit from full-screen presentation, but they don't require it. The thematic content is portable. It works whether you're watching in a cinema or on a tablet. However, this is not a film designed for distracted viewing. It rewards full attention. It rewards viewers who sit with it completely rather than skimming through it. If you commit to watching Shelter, if you give it your full attention for its full runtime, the film will give back what you invest in it. That investment yields understanding of character, appreciation of craft, and engagement with thematic complexity that casual viewing won't provide. The film is not long. 107 minutes is standard length for a contemporary drama, but those minutes are dense with meaning. There's no padding, no scenes included simply for spectacle or entertainment value. Every moment serves story or character or theme. This density means that the film's runtime flies. Viewers frequently express surprise at how quickly the film moves when it concludes, despite the apparent slowness of the opening act. The film is also worth rewatching. A second viewing provides opportunity to notice details missed on first viewing. The cinematographic choices, the performance nuances, the thematic connections that only become fully apparent once you know where the story goes. The film rewards repeated engagement. Many viewers who appreciate Shelter find that their understanding of it deepens significantly on second and subsequent viewings as they recognize the careful construction that supports its apparent simplicity. For viewers considering whether to invest time in this film, the answer is, if the premise interests you, if the idea of an assassin protecting a girl, if the exploration of trauma and connection, if the examination of masculinity and redemption appeals to your interests, then yes, absolutely watch it. Clear your schedule, commit to the runtime, pay full attention, and allow the film to affect you as it will. The film doesn't demand anything of you except that you show up and listen. It will do the complex emotional and psychological work itself. It will communicate its themes through performance and cinematography and editing. It will create the experience that it's designed to create if you allow it. That allowance, that willingness to be affected by cinema, is the only thing required from viewers. The broader conversation that Shelter enters about violence, trauma, redemption, and the possibility of connection between broken people is one that cinema has been engaging with for decades, but that remains perpetually relevant because it reflects complex, fundamental human questions. How do people become violent? Can that violence be redirected? Can people shaped by trauma build meaningful lives? Can connection happen between fundamentally broken people? These are questions that matter regardless of era or context. They matter because they're questions that many people face in their lives, not literally as assassins and fugitives, but as people attempting to heal from trauma, people attempting to love despite brokenness, people attempting to build meaning in circumstances that seem designed to prevent meaning. Shelter's particular argument that redemption is incomplete and ongoing, that connection is possible despite fundamental inadequacy, that survival is learning to continue despite threat, is an argument worth taking seriously. It's an argument that contradicts the typical narrative arc of redemption, which suggests that transformation is achievable, that the past can be overcome, that change is possible. Shelter suggests instead that these things are not true, and it suggests that this is okay. You don't need to overcome your past. You don't need to become fundamentally different. You need only to accept what you are and choose what to do with it. This is a radical argument in contemporary culture, which is often structured around self-improvement, personal transformation, and the narrative of becoming someone better. Shelter argues that this narrative is false and that accepting who you are while committing to someone else is a more honest and more valuable goal. The film sits in conversation with other sophisticated pieces of cinema and literature that have explored similar territory. The novels of Cormac McCarthy, particularly Blood Meridian and The Road, which explore violence and meaning without providing redemptive closure. The films of the Coen brothers, particularly No Country for Old Men, which suggest that the world is structured by forces beyond individual control. The work of Denis Villeneuve, who explores institutional systems and their psychological costs. The novels of Kent Haruf, which find profound meaning in small moments of connection between broken people. Shelter is working in this tradition of sophisticated storytelling that refuses easy answers while maintaining faith in the possibility of human connection. This tradition is vital in contemporary culture because it resists the false optimism that permeates much mainstream narrative. It doesn't suggest that everything will be fine if you just believe in yourself. It doesn't suggest that positive thinking can overcome systemic injustice. It doesn't suggest that love conquers all. It simply suggests that connection is valuable even when it doesn't solve anything, that meaning is possible even when circumstances are tragic, that showing up for another person matters even when showing up doesn't change the fundamental situation. This is the emotional and philosophical truth that Shelter communicates, and it's the reason the film matters beyond its status as entertainment. It's offering viewers a way of thinking about their own lives, their own relationships, their own ongoing struggles with trauma and brokenness. It's suggesting that these struggles don't need to be overcome to be meaningful. They simply need to be lived through with someone who matters. Shelter is a film that understands something fundamental about human beings, that we are all, in varying degrees, damaged. We are all shaped by circumstances beyond our control. We are all carrying trauma, loss, disappointment, fear. The film doesn't suggest that this damage can be fixed. It suggests instead that the damage can be acknowledged and that life can be built in the presence of that damage. This is the film's final statement, and it's a statement worth carrying with you beyond the theater. It's a statement that applies to the characters in the film, but it also applies to viewers watching the film. Whatever you're carrying, whatever damage, loss, trauma, brokenness you're holding, Shelter is suggesting that this is not disqualifying. Your brokenness doesn't disqualify you from matching to someone. Your damage doesn't make you incapable of commitment. Your trauma doesn't make connection impossible. It makes it harder, certainly. It complicates it, absolutely, but it doesn't make it impossible. Mason and Jessie's relationship is built on mutual brokenness. They're not healed people coming together. They're damaged people choosing connection anyway. And that choice, that daily recommitment to showing up despite inadequacy, is what constitutes love. This understanding, if you take it with you from Shelter, has the potential to change how you think about your own relationships, your own capacity for connection, your own possibility for meaning in the aftermath of trauma. The film isn't pretending that this is easy. It isn't suggesting that commitment solves anything or that connection makes the world safe. It's simply suggesting that commitment and connection matter, that they're worth the cost, that showing up for another person despite your fundamental inadequacy is one of the most meaningful things a human being can do. Shelter is a 2026 reminder that action cinema can be sophisticated, that trauma can be taken seriously, that redemption is incomplete and ongoing, that love is possible between broken people, and that survival is learning to continue anyway. The final image of Mason and Jessie driving toward the interior, toward the center, toward the future, toward the ongoing process of building life together despite everything, is the image that should stay with you. Not an image of triumph, triumph. Not an image of escape, simply an image of two people choosing to continue, to matter to each other, to build meaning despite threat. If you take anything from Shelter, let it be this. You don't need to be whole to love someone. You don't need to be healed to show up. You don't need to be redeemed to matter. You simply need to choose, daily, to be present with someone who matters to you. And that choice, repeated, consistent, committed despite difficulty, is everything.